Good evening and welcome to today's panel conversation on racial disparities in the education system, preschool, elementary school, and high school. My name is Michael Delicarpini. I'm a faculty member and former dean of the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania and faculty director of the SNF Padilla program at Penn, whose mission is to facilitate robust, informed, and respectful dialogue on the many difficult, contentious issues facing the nation and the globe, and across the many ideological, cultural, and demographic divides that too often keep us from effectively addressing these issues. For those of you who are new to this series, the panel is the 8th of 13 we are holding over the course of this academic year as part of the Preceptorial, which is essentially a non-credit bearing course on racism and anti-racism in contemporary America. The Preceptorial is designed for Penn undergrads, but each panel is open to the entire Penn community and to the larger public. I'm pleased to say that we have over 120 people registered for today's event. The Preceptorial is sponsored by the SNF Padilla program at Penn, but it's also co-sponsored by a number of other important Penn centers and offices, including the Office of the Vice President for Social Equity and Community, the Office of the Provost, the Andrea Mitchell Center, Civic House, and new student orientation and academic initiatives, all as part of the Year of Civic Engagement at Penn. While inspired by events such as the murder of George Floyd and the resulting protests and demonstrations and the calls for change that emerged from them, this series of panel discussions is designed to explore the ways in which racism has long been embedded in our country's economic, housing, public health, criminal justice, education, cultural, media, and political systems, to better understand the root causes of this structural racism and to identify what we have or might do to address these inequalities. Today's panel is the first of two focusing on the education system. I should note to the audience now that you can use the Q&A function on your screen to ask questions. While we won't be able to answer all of them directly, we'll leave some time towards the end of today's panel for me to ask our panelists some of them on your behalf. We have another stellar panel to address today's issues and your questions, who I will now very briefly introduce. So if I could ask the panelists to please unmute your videos now so the audience can see you as I do the introductions. So first is Vivian Gadsden, the William T. Carter Professor of Child Development and Education at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Gadsden is the director of the National Center on Fathers and Families and associate director of the National Center on Adult Literacy. She's an active member of the American Educational Research Association, the Society for Research in Child Development, and the International Reading Association, having held leadership roles in each of those organizations. She also serves on a number of local and national advisory boards and panels. Dr. Gadsden's research interests focus on cultural and social factors affecting learning and literacy across the life course and within families, particularly those at the greatest risk for academic and social vulnerability. Her writing focuses on intergenerational learning, particularly on the relationships between literacy and families and issues of culture, race, gender, and poverty in diverse learning contexts. She's author of numerous publications, including the forthcoming edited volume, Incarcerated Parents and Their Children. Among her several current research projects is a longitudinal study on intergenerational learning within African American and Latino families. Welcome, Vivian. Our second panelist is Janel George, Senior Policy Advisor at the Learning Policy Institute, which, working with policymakers, researchers, and educators, community groups, and others, seeks to advance evidence-based policies that support empowering and providing equitable learning for all children. In her role as Senior Policy Advisor, Ms. George co-leads the Equitable Resources and Access Team and is the lead author of the report, The Federal Role and School Integration, Brown's Promise and Present Challenges. More broadly, her work focuses on community schools, racial equity, education as a civil right, school choice, and other issues that shape equity and access in public schools. She has over a decade of experience working on legislative and policy advocacy and analysis, including as a legal fellow, counsel, and director with several nonprofits. She also served as legislative counsel in both the House of Representatives and the Senate, during which time her legislative portfolio included child welfare and education issues. As an attorney with the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, Ms. George worked on several campaigns and coalitions to use legislative and policy advocacy to advance equal educational opportunity, and she co-authored the report, Unlocking Opportunity for African American Girls, a call to action for educational equity. Welcome, Janel.
Thank you.
Our third panelist is Leah Gillian, a postdoctoral fellow in the School of Education at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Gillian, who earned her PhD from Princeton University in the Department of Sociology and Demography, is a former middle school and high school math teacher, during which time she developed a commitment and passion for improving the academic outcomes of marginalized groups. Her research interests focus on the politics of education, educational inequality, neighborhoods, race and ethnicity, and public policy. Specifically, her work examines how political preferences of individuals and communities can affect the educational outcomes of racial ethnic minority students. Dr. Gillian's current book project, Assessing Ideologies, Spatial Polity, and Politics in Education, examines how partisanship is associated with educational inequality, exploring the potential mechanisms that can facilitate or hinder racial equality in educational institutions. Welcome, Leah. Last, but certainly not least, is Dr. Jessie Harper, Assistant Dean for Faculty Affairs and Diversity and inaugural co-director of HEARD, the Hub for Equity, Anti-Oppression, Research and Development in the Graduate School of Education at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Harper's courses offered at both GSE and the School of Social Policy and Practice include American Racism and Understanding Social Change and Examining the School to Prison Pipeline, Implications of History, Policy, and Race. Dr. Harper's research interests include ex-offender reentry, especially the challenges faced by former prisoners as they re-enter the workforce. She presented the results of her research to the Criminal Business Committee, a group of federal judges who will oversee reentry efforts in Philadelphia, and she's also presented her research to the reentry team at the Federal Probation Department. Welcome very much, Jessie. So thank you all for participating. I know you're all busy and are being asked to do these kinds of things regularly, so I'm really pleased to have you all here today. And let me just start by saying, while today's panel focus on the education system, I'd like to give each of the panelists a chance to reflect on recent events, in particular, but not necessarily only or necessarily, the recent election, the problematic transition in government, the impeachment hearings, and or the first months of the Biden administration, but also other events, local or national, all of which will have major implications for issues of racial justice generally in the US. So I'd like to start with you, Leah, since I know some of your work focuses on politics. What are your thoughts on these or any other recent events, the role race might have played in them, and their implications for issues of race and racism in the US, in the education system or beyond the education system as we move forward? Oh, you're muted, Leah.
Hi.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. So my research primarily looks at politics and education. And a recent event that kind of took me by surprise was the voting for affirmative action in California. California is a highly democratic state. We right before the election, they asked Democrats, well, asked everyone, what's the most important problem facing the nation today? And overwhelmingly, Democrats said it was race relations. But when they came to vote on the issues of affirmative action, they actually voted against overturning that ban. And not only did they vote to overturn it, but the gap was wider than when they first overturned it in 1996. So it's not like they're improving where it was close. And this kind of sets it up for looking at how the role that politics, and you think about your allies in trying to craft policy for education. So I look a lot at school segregation, and I think that's also part of the housing problem. So how are we going to get, I guess, allies to help us have school integration, have residential integration. If we can't even, if they can say the right things, but they don't vote in the way they talk. So that was a recent event that took me by surprise.
Well, and
Sure.
that's a really important one that I actually have to admit I was not familiar with, and hopefully we can return to that issue broadly, at least when we talk about how potential solutions. But thank you for that. Jessie, anything you'd like to focus on or reflect on?
Yeah, I think mine has to do with the complexity of working through the issues related to COVID-19. We know that a lot of the prisons and even jails are considering ways to release prisoners because many of them are being infected by COVID-19, and there's really no way to be socially distant in prison. But one of the issues, and I think this is a much larger issue with people who are incarcerated, is that when solutions are sought, nobody really looks at the bigger picture. So once you release them, that might solve one problem, but it might create other problems for them. Or are there going to be individuals who will house them? Who will hire them, right? Because without options, they're going to recidivate, right?
Yeah.
So I think that COVID-19 has really laid bare some of the just larger problems that exist for a lot of marginalized groups.
Yeah, thank you for focusing on that. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Jessie, but to my knowledge, they're not even in the queue. Am I missing that? I know they have the different levels. You know, I'm now waiting as a plus 65-year-old with no underlying health conditions to get my shots, but I don't even see them in the list that I see. Am I missing something there?
Well, they are now in the queue for some states.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. Vivian, any thoughts on recent events or anything you want to reflect on?
Sure, I was just thinking, in fact, thank you, Michael, and thank you for inviting us. About what Jessie just said, they're in the queue for some states, but there's been a lot of controversy about whether they should be in the queue. Right. So it's pretty complex. Yeah. So I will say a kind of small local issue or proximal issue and a larger issue. So for me, the proximal issue is, what are students in schools understanding about this time that we're in? What is the nature of the preparation that teachers will get to allow there to be some interrogation by students about these issues? And what is it that we teach students about what a democracy is and their role in it, and race relations and historical events? You know, I've been overwhelmed by, you know, the young who have had extraordinarily racist perspectives and have brought, you know, those perspectives into the main fray. And then the second part is, we talk a lot about how concerned we are about students not being able to go to school. But we're less concerned, it seems to be, about what it is that we're actually going to teach them, and the quality of the buildings and the schooling. You know, the quality, in Philadelphia, we have schools that have asbestos. Young children are going to go into those schools unless all of that is removed. We are not really prepared for the students to go back to school. And then what is the curriculum to which they will be exposed? You know, this is just such a propitious moment to move further. And I'm just highly desirous of our being able to move this to the next step and being able to make these promises that have resulted from COVID-19 something that people can really stake claim to.
That's great. Thank you, Vivian. And COVID-19 revealed at least one of those issues you were talking about, when a lot of schools can't open because they don't have proper ventilation.
Yes.
And so, yeah, but I think those are all issues we can return to in this panel, because they're all relevant to how we solve some of the inequities that we're seeing. Janel, what would you like to focus on?
Sure, and thank you again for having me for this discussion. And I think my concerns overlap with all of the issues that have really been mentioned. So definitely the COVID-19 and the reopening of schools and ensuring that students have the supports and services that they need. And I want to go back to something that Leah mentioned about segregation. We know that those schools that are with high populations of students of color and students from low-income families are under-resourced and don't have, for example, the infrastructure or the ventilation systems that Dr. Gadsden was mentioning that they actually need. And I'm thinking about COVID relief and how to ensure that those funds are actually targeted to those students in those schools most in need. So I think that that is a primary concern, but I also think in many ways COVID has just exposed a lot of long-standing and deep-seated educational inequities. And I'm also thinking about segregation, again, which aligns with so many inequalities, including resource inequities. I think a lot of the divisiveness that we're seeing is largely attributable to long-standing segregation. And in the huge COVID relief bill that was passed, there was language included that removed a long-standing prohibition on use of federal funds to support transportation for school integration. And a lot of people didn't even notice that. But that even that provision by itself had bipartisan support when it was passed in the 70s, and it has stood in law for almost half a century. And so just thinking about the different obstacles that have hindered voluntary local desegregation efforts and how we're seeing such deep segregation that's perpetuating inequality.
Well, that's so. I want to make sure I understand, Janel. Was that taken out of the COVID-19 bill, or did it remain?
The bill included language that actually removed a couple of there were 3 provisions that barred use of federal funds to support transportation. So 2 of them were removed in prior years, and the language included in the bill removed this final provision. After all these years, yeah.
Thank you for pointing that out. So you've actually already started to do this, but let's turn now to the specific topic of today's panel. And I'd like to start by giving the audience a sense of the scope of the problem by describing the various ways that preschool through high school educational practices and policies impact people of color differently than white Americans, both in statistical aggregate terms, but also in the lived experiences and day-to-day lives of African Americans. Once all the panelists have had a chance to weigh in, we'll then turn to a more specific conversation on what we know about the causes and potential remedies of the inequities that we're going to describe. So I'd like to start with you this time, Jessie. Can you give us a sense of the ways in which, again, thinking about preschool through high school, educational practices and policies treat Blacks and whites differently or effectively treat them differently? Are these differences shrinking or growing? Does it vary by region or locale and city? In particular, help us get a picture of how these practices impact African Americans individually and collectively, and the consequences for other aspects of their day-to-day lives, because education is related to so many different things. So, Jessie, why don't you start us off on any element of that?
All right, thank you, Michael. I wanted to talk a little bit about disproportionate discipline that impacts students of color in our school systems. When you ask for a recommendation for a video or a reading that's relevant to what's going on, I actually contributed. It was a short video about a young African-American girl who was remanded to juvenile justice, right? She actually was arrested because she skipped school and because she got in a fight with one of her classmates. So I think that it was so important to talk about this, because I think oftentimes people think of young African-American boys as being impacted by exclusionary discipline practices. And this is of course true, because nationwide, African-American boys are suspended and expelled more than any other group. Yep. But African-American girls, Black girls, are second. Yep. Right? So they're also experiencing this disproportionate discipline, these harsher discipline practices. The interesting thing about it is that it's not that they're misbehaving more. They're actually being excluded for doing things that their white counterparts do, or maybe things that are not even as serious, you know. So maybe they're being suspended for things like loudness, and for dress code violations, and for having a bad attitude, you know. It's also interesting that there was a recent Research for Action report on the topic of school policing. And that report showed that in Pennsylvania, Black and Hispanic girls' rate of school-based referral to law enforcement was 5 times higher than that of their white counterparts. Their rate of arrest was 4 times higher than that for white girls, right? And then for Black and Hispanic boys, the rate of referral was 3 times higher, both for exclusionary discipline and also for arrest in the school setting. So I think that actually brings to our attention another issue. You know, what is the role of police officers in schools? And I think that conversation has gotten a bit more attention in the wake of the protests last summer, with the wake of the death of George Floyd. You know, there's a little bit more of a conversation about what exactly the role of police officers in school, what is their role? So we know that when they're in school, they do just what police have been trained to do. They detain, they handcuff, and they arrest. So there's really no evidence to support the fact that they make schools safer, but they actually do make the environment more hostile and less safe for young people of color, including Black girls.
That's a really important point that you raise. I did get a chance when you sent me that video to look at it, and it is powerful. For the audience, it's available along with other readings for all the panels on the Preceptorial Canvas site. Unfortunately, it's only accessible to Penn faculty, staff, and students, but we're hoping to get it more publicly accessible at some point soon. But thank you for that. I mean, that's a part of one of the things about these panels is that we've been breaking the topics into different areas, and we just had a panel on incarceration issues generally, but what the points you just made show how ultimately you can't really separate out all of these issues, that issues of policing, issues of incarceration, and issues of education, issues of income and inequality, they all just overlap and are intertwined with each other. So thank you very much for that. Vivian, what would you like to add in terms of what the situation is, what the problem is that we're trying to address here?
Sure. Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you, Jessie. I think those were just important points that I would also just like to talk very briefly about, but then talk about early childhood a little bit. The issues of disproportionality have been discussed in so many different ways, whether it's Russ Skiba's work or Pedro Noguera, or even Sean Harper, who was here at Penn, or the Civil Rights Project. I think those are kind of broad-based issues that we keep circling around, and they are they bear a direct relationship to the treatment of children in schools, and the opportunities that are afforded them. And of course, Jessie's example of Black girls is a great example. My best example is that that many young Black girls are punished because they talk back. And I joke and say, well, please show me the adolescent who is not talking back, female adolescent. Yet they are punished in such severe ways. So really, thank you for that. The other thing I just like to note is to focus a little bit down the road with young children, because we are finding that young children who are Black are being punished and expelled from school, suspended from school in increasing numbers, particularly Black boys. And we have minimized the ways in which they are internalizing and experiencing race and certain kinds of racialization in schools. You know, preschool typically refers to kids who are before kindergarten, birth to 5. And then we think of kindergarten, to grade 3. And there are at least 4 issues. One has to do, in my opinion at least, one has to do with the quality of their experiences once they get in school. We know that African American and Latinx, low-income Latinx kids constitute about 70% across both groups are living in poverty. And so when they're going to school, are they in positions to be in the best settings? Are they understood? Are they challenged from the moment they get there and having to explain their behavior? Is there an assumption that they are so disadvantaged that we have very little hope for their learning? And certainly, this is my area, so there have been many strides that have been made. And one of the best strides has been the increase in the number of early child care centers. We know that my colleagues, John Fantuzzo and others, did a study to look at what was called early childhood deserts throughout the city, and there were many, and there still are many. But there have been, I guess, about 10,000 more slots that have become available in the past, let's say, 10 years, but still not enough. Yeah. And so we have pockets throughout the city where children simply, their parents don't have access to early child care centers. And even if they did, very often the centers or the school programs cannot accommodate the parents because the parents are not in high-paying jobs. They are typically in lower-paying jobs. Their schedules are unpredictable. As someone said the other day in the news, that we should expect anybody to live and raise a family on $7.50 an hour is, quite ridiculous. Yet this is what these families are doing. So negotiating what the schools can do and what the parents are able to do is complicated. And then the last thing I want to say is that, at least about early childhood, is that we have an issue with the workforce. A workforce that's disproportionately low income and people of color who make very little money, and female. And so there are efforts around Women's Way is trying to do a Gender Wealth Institute to not simply address those low income workers, but others as well. And I think the last thing is, once again, to talk about the disproportionality of punishment for young children, and fundamentally their treatment in these spaces.
Thank you. That really helps get a sense of some of the inequities that we're going to be addressing in this on this panel. Janel, what would you like to add to this?
Sure. Well, I really just echo the issues that Dr. Harper and Dr. Gadsden raised. This bias starts so early, and I really think it's important that we have the data and information on that. Right. So, for example, the Department of Education and Civil Rights data collection had a component collecting data on discipline disparities as early as preschool. And that's how we have some of the information on these significant racial disparities. That collection was eliminated. So hopefully we will be able to reinstate that and ensure that we're continuing to see how students are being treated and support schools in implementing inclusive, restorative approaches to school discipline. But it's really that bias that underlies these kind of disparities. We also have data showing that we know that inexperienced educators disproportionately work with students of color. And so that contributes to some of the rates and some of the disparities that we see as well. And there's another opportunity under the Obama administration, guidance documents were issued to states and districts to provide evidence-based approaches to restorative practices, to implementing inclusive discipline practices, to fostering positive school climates, as well as school integration. I think these are related, and I'm saying related in terms of the subject. These were separate guidance documents. Both of those guidance documents were rescinded. There's an opportunity to update the research on evidence-based approaches and strategies and reissue these guidance documents so that more schools and districts have tools and strategies about ways to implement and approach these issues. For example, there's research showing that implementation of social emotional learning has been found to foster positive and inclusive school climates. Implementation of culturally responsive curriculum so students can see themselves reflected in what they're learning. All of these are strategies and components that can support inclusive climates. And I would underscore again, segregation underlies a lot of the issues that we're seeing, particularly related to the lack of resources. And I know some people are probably thinking, you know, segregation is a thing of the past, and why is that even an issue? But we have data showing that the rates of segregation rival those that preceded the case of Brown versus Board of Education. About half as many Black students attend integrated schools as was the case in the late 1980s. And we see this hyper segregation by both race and class that again, underlies it also creates accompanying resource inequities. So it's not just about Black children attending school with white children, it's the resource inequities, including inexperienced educators that characterize highly segregated, under-resourced schools that serve a lot of students of color and students from low-income families.
That last point you're making is a really important one. It's not only that, from what I'm hearing you say, that African American children get treated differently when they're in school. It's that the schools that they attend differ. My words now, not yours, because you mentioned inexperienced teachers, but I would say possibly then less quality education, and in buildings and infrastructures that are less accommodating to students. So it feeds on itself in ways that are really problematic. So thanks for bringing those points on. Leah, would you like to jump in here?
Yeah, I'd like to pretty much piggyback on what all of my colleagues have said. I think there's a lot of biases in suspensions, the way we suspend students, but also in grading as well. We know that Black students are graded differently. In my own research, I found that Republicans are less, if you're a conservative, you're less likely to recommend a Black student for advanced classes in comparison to a white student. And liberals actually are more likely to recommend a Black student for advanced classes than white students. So we see there's differences in grading. And also I think I'm a big believer that segregation is a huge problem because as was said earlier, you have differences in access to school resources, which is huge. Hyper-segregated schools offer inferior educations because of the reasons that have already been stated. And then I want to say on top of all of this, the COVID has disproportionately affected minority students. And their families. Their families are essential workers, so they're being affected on that front. And then the students, many students are not even back in school, as here in Philadelphia after a year. And this great quote that I read in the New York Times, one of the parents actually in Philly said, "School districts are taking advantage of our disadvantage." And I thought that was really profound. They don't have, as Dr. Gadsden said, the buildings are in such poor condition and they don't really have a plan to update them so students can get back to school. And so I'd like to leave it at that.
Yeah, that's great. And when you were talking about the ideological differences and how students are treated from your research, are you talking about the teachers themselves, their ideological perspective leading to those kinds of different treatments, or?
Yeah, teachers and educators, people who work in education, I found differences in the way they recommend students, which goes along with some of the biases in grading that we see.
I've not seen research like that. That's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. So what I'd like to do now that we have at least a partial picture of the differences in educational practice and policies and how they're applied across race, as well a little bit of the sense of the consequences of those differences. Let's turn to the causes of these differences, although you've already begun to bring up some of those causes. But what do we know about why these differences exist and persist? What role does the ways in which policies are developed and implemented play in causing or exacerbating these racial inequalities? How much of it is an issue of funding? And also, more directly, what role does implicit and explicit racism play in all of this? So, Vivian, if you could get us started on this, what do we think is the reasons for this? Are they identifiable? I know they're deep-seated and complicated, but could you say anything about what we know about the causes of all this?
Well, the stratification starts early, and it continues. My best example has always been in elementary school. Kids are divided into I don't know the names because we didn't have those names when I was in first and second grade, but the bluebirds and the whomever. And I always think that they end up being the pathway to tracking. So if you are in the top reading group, guess what track you will be in when you get to high school. And so there is something already embedded and is already ensconced in the ways in which we see the possibilities for children, with the assumption that that's the best way. If we base our understandings or our approaches on what children present when they enter into school, we're doing the best thing, as opposed to really thinking critically about how those kids get supported in a number of different ways. Certainly there have been studies to try to increase kids' test scores, but what is it fundamental to those kids' everyday experiences, their treatment in the schools? When we have had reading programs, what we have found is that if you work really directly and strategically with children, they actually do learn to read unless there is some other complicating factor. But the investment is not made in those kinds of activities, not, as it turns out, not just for Black kids, but for poor kids, more broadly defined. I also think that the policies are often generic, and by being generic, they end up reinscribing racist practices, because we can always excuse it and say it's for everyone. Well, as it turns out, different people have different kinds of needs. And some of those people have been historically marginalized for 400 years, let's say. And so when we talk about these quick fixes and our conscience and our consciousness being raised, our consciousness will have to stay raised. We have to figure out how to prop them up and continue to interrogate the ways in which the system reinscribes itself every day, to make, to exclude folks. And I actually did look in the question and answer, because I did have a point. And, one example is even the ways in which we have special, kinds of schools. And one young person with whom I work, who goes to Central High School here in Philadelphia, said something that was so powerful and painful to me to hear. He did not go to what would be considered one of the quality middle schools, elementary and middle schools. And he talked about what it meant. What does it mean for kids like himself to have gone to a school where he wasn't challenged as much? And he gets to Central High School, he doesn't end up in the top tier, mostly because he simply did not have the exposures in his elementary and middle school. I didn't have a quick answer for him, nor would I give him a quick answer. But the point is that young people are thinking about these issues, and we have a system that is inherently problematic around identifying needs of different groups early on and providing support.
Thank you for that. That's really important. And I should say that, while I said that we would curate some questions at the end, feel free to look at the Q&A, which all of you have available to you, all of the panelists. And if there's something that comes up that you'd want to bring in earlier, feel free to do that. So thanks for doing that, Vivian. Janel, give us your thoughts on some of the root causes of the problems that we've identified.
Sure. I mean, I think it's in the fabric of our nation. The institution of slavery. I teach a course on racial justice in K through 12 public education. And, I'm sure when the students look at the syllabus and they see a portion of Frederick Douglass's narrative as an enslaved person, they're probably surprised, but I think we have to start there. The denial of education to enslaved persons and what that meant. And, the fact that we didn't really even have our modern day public education system until Reconstruction. And the newly elected Black congressmen who themselves had been denied educational opportunity led in the creation of our modern day public school system. And they ensured that they embedded in state constitutional language a provision of education. It was a condition of readmission to the Union for Southern states to have an education provision. And it was so many formerly enslaved people who really advocated for that. And, a lot of people believe that we never would have had a Civil War if public education had been more widely available and not just available to wealthy or white families, because poor white children also went without education. So I do think we have to go back that far. And I know, again, some people think like, why look at the past? Because that's where we see the creation of so many of our systems and our policies, and just understanding how this idea of second-class citizenship of people of color was baked into so many of these systems and policies and practices, and that we really do have to interrogate those policies and those systems and recognize how, as Dr. Gadsden said, they can replicate racial inequality.
Yeah, I mean, please don't apologize for bringing history into this. I think part of the point that I've come to learn really through these panels that we've been having is you cannot talk about any of these issues without talking about their historical roots, and those historical roots trace back to slavery. So thank you for bringing that up. Leah, what are some of your thoughts on the causes of the inequities in the education system? Yep, you're still muted.
Once again, I study politics and education, so I always harp on this. I thought it was quite interesting when I first started doing this research. The most segregated school districts in our nation were New York City and LA Unified, two heavily Democratic school districts. And so I started doing research because I have the politics by school districts, the political makeup of the community. In this current paper that I'm working on, I find that more Democratic areas have higher levels of school segregation than Republican school, when you have more Republican voters. And at first I thought it's because you have probably less minorities in these Republican areas, so it's harder to have school segregation. However, when I restricted it to school districts with a high number of minorities and a high number of white students, I still found that you had more segregation in school districts that had more Democrats. And I thought that was fascinating. I think it goes back to politics. We had a speaker who came to the school, he's at the Urban League, I believe, and he said that school districts use a strategy of gerrymandering their attendance boundaries. And we usually think of gerrymandered attendance boundaries as a way to exclude people, but he said the new form of that, he's finding that they're using that for integration, because our residents our housing is so segregated that if you allow everybody to go to the school that's closest to where they live, you're going to have a segregated school. But now cities are using gerrymandered attendance boundaries to increase integration within a school district. And he showed a picture between St. Louis and Philadelphia. He found that Philadelphia was more segregated than St. Louis school district because Philadelphia does not use gerrymandered attendance boundaries while St. Louis did. And going back to this question that we saw on the discussion board, I do think that school districts, schools like Central and Masterman do exacerbate school segregation. However, schools are kind of in a conundrum. They have these quality schools to entice families, well-off families, to live in the city and contribute tax money to the city. There's a great book, I think, Making Schools, Making Markets, I believe, that talks about schools are now used as a way to entice suburban families to come back to school. So it's a delicate balance that school districts have to kind of balance to try and have integration, but at the same time, bring that tax dollar to the city.
So that finding from your own research that it's Democratic communities that seem to be the most segregated, do you have a guess even what that is the result of? Because that's really
that's what has taken me so long, because it doesn't make sense. But I feel that like the not in my backyard model, it's like they don't mind spending more money, because I just submitted a paper that finds that when you have more Democrats, you collect more local taxes for schools, while Republican school districts, you collect less local taxes. So they don't mind spending more money, but they don't want their children to be like the guinea pigs, sort of say.
I think that makes perfect sense to me. I mean, I don't have any evidence for this, but the idea that it's Democrats who are also liberals, who might think of education as more central to their children's development, but it leads to the emergence of their implicit racism, in that they think, okay, if I want to give my kid a good education, like you said, I don't want to be the guinea pig. I think diversity is great, but I'm worried about what the education for my child is going to be like, because they have implicitly racist viewpoints underlying them. That's my guess, but
Michael?
Yes, please, Vivian.
Yeah, and I just say something in reference to that. That's an excellent point, Leah. We have within school stratification as well. So even in those schools, we're attracting, let's be candid, we're trying to attract white and upper middle class folks to bring their kids back. And so within the schools themselves, the kids who are in the upper echelon of students end up being disproportionately white and upper middle class, and then all the other kids are in the rest of the school.
That's right. And that both affects the education and their future progress, and I'm sure their self-esteem and sense of self-worth in those kind of settings. So it's a complicated issue. Jessie, what would you like to add to this piece of the conversation?
Yeah, I just appreciate everything that was said. I agree with everything that was said. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the role of bias when it comes to stratification and disproportionate discipline, because I think that it's important to acknowledge that teachers and administrators and all of these adults that interact with these children do not exist apart from their own social contexts, right? So what that means is that we all live in a society where we're not immune to the cultural conditioning that leads to bias and racism, right? So in fact, there was this really interesting study from this report from the Georgetown University Center on Poverty and Inequality. And what it showed is that adults view Black girls as more adult-like and less innocent than their white counterparts, starting at age 5. They're often viewed as more dangerous than their peers, hypersexualized, angry, loud, defiant, and they're punished for more subjective infractions like talking back, as Vivian had mentioned earlier. And then their nonconformity to traditional expectations for girls has also prompted more severe punishment. And as was brought out earlier, the more inexperienced the teacher is with classroom management, the more they'll rely on the school resource officers and the police officers in schools. So this belief that they're somehow older, these young Black girls or these young Black children, this belief that they need less nurturing, what that really leads to is them being punished for mistakes. A mistake that a young child would make, being punished harshly, harsher treatment, and also victim blaming.
Yep.
And it also is interesting in that Research for Action report that I had mentioned earlier, it really showed that school districts that have more students of color tend to spend more money on law enforcement in school, right? So they'll spend more money on law enforcement and less money on resources like school counselors and school nurses in some cases.
Wow, that again, there's so many things that you've taught me on this panel that I did not know, and they seem surprising. Is there a point at which that shifts over if it's a high majority of students of color, or is it just keep going that the more students of color, the more money is spent? Do you know? You may not know.
I think that just on average,
Yeah, on
right?
average,
Just
okay.
on average,
Yeah.
nationwide,
Yep.
that's the case according to that report.
Yeah, well, that certainly is another example of the underlying bias that you were just describing. Yeah. Okay, so let's, in the time we have left before we try to do a few more questions, so thank you for already addressing some of the questions from the audience, and please feel free to continue to do that. What I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about what we have or what we can do that we haven't tried yet to improve some of these issues that you've described. I know that's a complicated thing to try to respond to, but are there examples of what has worked at least partially, things that we have not tried that we should? How do we begin to solve the problem? What role might local governments play? Might the federal government play? Universities like Penn, the public more broadly? But what do we know about, is the problem that we have a pretty good idea of what would improve this, but we haven't implemented them? Or do we not even know what might help address some of these issues? And I know that's a big question, and with apologies, I'm going to start with you, Janel, if you have any thoughts on give us some hope, I guess is what I'm saying.
Well, I think that we do have some evidence of what works. And I'm thinking particularly about school integration. For a brief period of time, all branches of the federal government were really proactively addressing school segregation. So after Brown, we had massive resistance to desegregation orders. And it really wasn't until probably over 10 years later that we have the executive strongly supporting school desegregation, passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, and then sanctions that were attached to the Civil Rights Act, and also oversight and enforcement. So a lot of people think that no districts ever lost federal funds, but the Department of Education terminated funding for non-compliant school districts I think over 200 fund terminations. So there was this short period of time when there was very proactive federal enforcement. And a lot of states and districts also supported desegregation efforts, and we did see a lot of progress. There was closing of so-called achievement gaps, the Black and white achievement gaps. There was a lot more progress with desegregation. They really reached a height in the late 1980s, but then also very intentional retreat from that as well. So lack of investment. There was the Emergency School Aid Act, which actually supported state or district desegregation efforts. That was eliminated. Low funding for the magnet schools assistance program. I saw a question in the chat about magnet schools, and could they actually help promote desegregation, or do they deepen it? And I'm actually working right now on a report on magnet schools, and I would say it depends. It depends on how they're designed, and it depends on how they're implemented. But research shows that those magnet schools that center school diversity, that conduct family and community outreach, and I saw another question about parent involvement. It has to be ongoing, not just to draw families to a diverse school, but to include them in decision making throughout the enrollment of the child, inclusive enrollment practices, and the provision of public transportation, because as was previously mentioned, housing segregation is still so deeply entrenched. So ensuring that students are actually able to attend these schools is really, really important. So I think we have evidence of what works. It's about how it's implemented, how it's supported, and there have been some legal challenges to a lot of voluntary desegregation programs, which it seems has created a lot of uncertainty about how you can best approach some of these strategies and programs. That's why we need a lot of evidence-based strategies and to share more of this research.
That's great. Thank you, Janel. Leah, any solutions that have been tried and seem to help or that could be tried that you're familiar with?
Yeah, well, first I want to say that I agree with everything that Dr. George just said. I like to give an example about in New Jersey. There was a lawsuit many decades ago to put projects in a suburban area, Mount Laurel. And recently, maybe in the 2000s, they finally built those projects. And well, I guess government housing is the more appropriate term. They built the government housing in this suburban, nice neighborhood, and students started moving in. There's a book about this, and specifically a chapter looks at the kids' outcomes. They said the children who have left from the, I guess, cities where the inner cities of, is it Camden, I believe, and surrounding areas, they've moved into Mount Laurel, and the children are doing better in school. They said their grades didn't improve, but that's because they said the school was actually harder, but they were doing better overall. So I think I'm a huge believer in housing policies. If we can have more affordable housing in better neighborhoods, I think that will help with our school system. That will help with our school segregation.
That's a great concrete example. Thank you for that. Jessie.
I think that there's a role for professional development for teachers and administrators that really helps them to be able to discover and unpack their own biases. Something that also helps them to become a little bit more trauma informed when it comes to dealing with some of the communities that they're teaching. Looking at alternatives to exclusionary discipline. So there's a role both for professional development and for policies, right? And just as an example of a school that was trying to move in that direction, Columbus City Schools, right? They actually changed their policy, and no young girl was ever suspended for having a bad attitude or a dress code violation, right? They were not suspended for that. They also made sure that each of the young girls in the school had a mentor, somebody that they could go to if they felt as if they needed someone to talk to. And then the fact that they even invited parents. So parental engagement was kind of central to these changes that they were trying to make. So they included the parents in what was appropriate when it came to a dress code and also school discipline. So I think that's essential, just better professional development and also engaging the parents in some of these new policies.
That's great. Again, really concrete and imaginable things. That's terrific. Let's see. So Vivian, I think we have not gotten to you yet on this question.
I've talked a lot, so I don't know. But of course, I do have a couple of things to say. I just want to highlight Leah's point about the shift in kids' performance once they are exposed to different kinds of neighborhoods. That was the study that was done in Chicago as well by the folks at Northwestern, where they moved kids out of low-income housing and found some changes. But there are some things that I also think what Jessie talked about in relationship to preparing teachers to teach the children who are in front of you, not the ones that you might have imagined. that you would have, and knowing something about it, not just a hit or miss course in multicultural education or some general statement, but some really critical analyses of what's going on in some way to follow up. I think that we do have. I think documenting where the racial disparities are is something that we need to care about. Some places have tried to do it. Right now, I'm doing a study with the Department of Human Services where they're looking at disproportionality in out-of-home placements, for example. But it is that kind of inward or internal interrogation or examination of what's going on when the practices are resulting in a disproportionate number of people who are in out-of-home placements. And the city of Philadelphia is a case in point, highest out-of-home placement in the country. Blacks are significantly overrepresented. So why can't we do that kind of work within schools where we know that we have increasing numbers of ethnically and linguistically diverse children and families, of immigrant families, of disconnects between the workforce and schools. And there are some places that are beginning to do some of that work. If we are able to do work more collaboratively as well, say, for example, better connections between schools and Health and Human Services or other departments, we could see where some of those linkages are disadvantaging certain groups of children and where there may be some pockets of advantage. It's not all a horrible story. And learn from that.
Yep. That's great, Vivian. Again, really imaginable and concrete examples of what has been done in some places and what might be done. I want to thank you also for all of you for taking into consideration some of the questions we've been getting from the audience. In the 10 minutes or less that we have, I wanted to raise a couple of the others that I don't think we quite touched on. So several of you mentioned either directly or indirectly the notion of culturally responsive teaching, both the way in which teaching is done to match the student, but also the subject matter I would throw in as part of that. And the question is a really straightforward one. If that seems to make so much sense, common sense, and there's evidence that it seems to work, why isn't it done more? I think I know what the answer to that might be, but I'm curious as to do any of you want to take on that question of if something like that seems to make so much sense, why is it less common than you would expect?
I think the answer is multifold, I can just say. I think in part, it's not a comfortable framework. And people think you have to be special to be able to do it, when in fact, we all represent some kind of cultural history. And the question is always whose cultural history gets to be the dominant cultural history. And so if you believe that yours is the only one, that could be a threatening pedagogical model. But we do know that it has, significance. And we have seen it work in so many places. There are other offshoots of culturally relevant pedagogy as well that have been equally successful in sensitizing students. My best example has come from, and I'll make this short because we don't have much time, but when I was president of right as I was elected president of the American Educational Research Association, Dylan Roof shot people and killed people.
Oh, yeah.
In Charleston, the place where I was born, in a church that was down the street from our Episcopal Church parish. It was an area that we knew some of the people. And after trying to figure it out, trying to make sense to it, I just gave this example last week. I read the manifesto as they were talking about how poorly educated he was. And the manifesto wasn't badly written. And so you said, well, this kid learn something in school. Why did not he learn something about what it means to respect all people? And so it's not easy, and I think there's pressure to be put on people to think more strategically about how to integrate culturally relevant pedagogy or framings that allow for that kind of expansive way of understanding what teaching and learning can look like.
Thank you, Vivian, and thank for that example. It really makes the point about as clearly as you could. I want to bring up two other kind of sets of questions that have been raised, and you can take on either one of them in the 5 minutes or so that we have left. One is a question about what's the efficacy, what's the role, the potential of having more Black and brown teachers in the classrooms? Is there any evidence that helps, that that's a solution? Is that even an issue right now in public schools at this level? And the second set of questions has to do with school funding. You all know how, although it varies from communities, basically how schools are funded. What's its role in the inequities, and is that something that there's any reason to have hope might be changed? Has it ever been changed? The dependence on property taxes, for example. So any of you want to address either of those questions? The issue of having more teachers of color in the classroom, and the issue of how we generally tend to fund local public schools.
I can make a brief comment just about school funding. And again, the modern public school system was developed quite a while back. And so we do have, for many state school finance system, this reliance on local property taxes. The federal government probably funds, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7%, a small proportion of school funding. And the rest is split between states and districts. But localities that have those higher property values obviously are able to generate more funding for education. And even when you have states that step in to fill the gap, this process known as equalization, where a state might provide additional funds to a lower property wealth district, it's often still not enough to fully fill the gap. And we know from research as well, students in areas of concentrated poverty have more needs. So it's not always about giving students the same in terms of funding, but what they actually need. In some states like California that have implemented more weighted student funding formulas that respond to and recognize students' differing needs, whether they are English learners or students living in concentrated poverty, have more potential of really being more responsive and supporting districts and not allowing that kind of inequality to continue to let those gaps persist. So I think it's worth looking at some of these approaches that are more differentiated, if you will, more the weighted student funding approaches.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Janel.
I just like to piggyback on that. School, what she said is, and also what Dr. Harper said. So even when you have equal funding between high poverty schools and wealthy schools, high poverty schools have so many extra expenses. So I think Dr. Harper was talking about school resource officers they have to pay for. You rarely see those type of things in the wealthy wealthy suburban districts, where they have to have extra security guards. And also they have more students who have special needs, which require additional teachers. It's just a higher cost. So even when you do have equal funding, there's still inequality gaps.
I think that's a point that many people don't see and miss. So thank you for bringing that up. Anyone like to say anything about the idea of what the utility or effectiveness of having more teachers of color in the classroom? Is there any evidence that makes a difference for the education process?
I would like to say something about that. I do think that it would be helpful to have more diversity, more teachers of color. But unless the policies change, the school level policies, the federal policies, the state policies, unless they change, we're not going to see a significant difference. Because if it's the school policy to use exclusionary discipline practices, right? the person is going to feel as if they're kind of hitting a wall, even if they don't believe in them personally, right? They pretty much are subject to the policies that, in which they're of the school in which they're operating, in which they're trying to work. So there needs to be efforts to really change some of these policies, and also to create more diversity among the teaching staff.
Well said, and an important point. Thank you. Yeah, Janel, looks like you'd like to jump in.
I just want to add briefly, so I agree. There is research showing, particularly students of color, do well when they have teachers of color. I would also add to Dr. Harper's point about policies to help people of color who are interested in entering the teaching profession to enter it, to graduate without enormous debt, and to have the support that they need, whether it's through residencies or preparation programs, so that they can be successful. Those other supporting policies are needed as well.
That's great. Thank you very much. So I'm really aware of time, and I'd like to apologize to the attendees whose questions we were unable to get to, although I'll say I think we did a better job on this panel than most, thanks to the panelists who took the initiative to start answering your questions. So I'm going to try to build that into the panels we have remaining. But before we end, I'd like to encourage our audience members to consider attending our next panel, which will be the second of two on the education system in the U.S., this one focusing on higher education. That panel will take place on Tuesday, March 16th from 5 to 6:15, and we'll be sending out information about how to register for that panel soon. And I'll just say we have another great set of panelists for that panel, so please spread the word when you see the registration form and consider attending. With that, I really want to thank our panelists. I thought this was just an enlightening conversation. I feel like I know more about this issue than I did when I entered this panel, and I hope the audience feels the same way. I'd like to thank our audience for attending and ask you all to enjoy the rest of your evening, and I hope to get to see you all at future panels. So thanks again. I really appreciate the time you've given us.